Well, man, what a morning. What a good morning. My name is Nate, and I'm the lead pastor at Restoration Church, and I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm so glad that I have the opportunity to talk to you this morning and to share out of the Bible and to talk about Jesus this morning. Before we kind of get into that, I'm gonna need your help a little bit. So I mentioned before I was in California yesterday. The staff and I were in California last week. The group of churches that were a part of the Assemblies of God, they have a business meeting for the entire United States every other year. And so that meeting was last week, and so we went to that. I pulled into my driveway at 2:30 a.m. a few hours ago and fell asleep after 3:30, and then we had Michelle and our kids with us. Then we woke up at 6:15 this morning to start getting ready for church. So I am very tired, and it has affected me in this very bizarre way. In the first service, we're preaching about Jonah, but in the first service, I kept saying Noah instead of Jonah, and then someone said I even said Nona at one part, and so someone's like, my Grammy, why are we talking about her? And so I need your help because we put these messages online. I cannot do that this service. So the first service, we burned it. We're not going to use that. We can't show that to anybody. So, if I do that this service, that's a big mistake. So if I say Noah, you say Jonah. All right, let's practice it like we're a hip-hop concert. When I say Noah, you say Jonah. Noah. Jonah. Noah. Jonah. And prayerfully, we don't have to do that. When I was in college, there was this guy who was also enrolled in the school, and his name was Mark. And he was also a student. He lived in the dorms, and honestly, the guy was a little bit odd, and more odd as I would find out later. And I have many stories I'll maybe share about him through the next number of decades that we're together. But he was odd, and he came back mid-semester, and I found out, because I found him in the yearbook, he came to the school at different times over like the previous 15 years, and we just find this picture randomly through old yearbooks. And so he came mid-semester, and for whatever reason, I saw him walking through campus, and so I opened my friend's dorm room, and I yelled out to him, "Hey, Mark!" And Mark took off in a full sprint the opposite direction of me. And we were all burst out laughing. We didn't know what he was doing. I mean, he ran till we couldn't see him anymore. We don't know when he stopped running, don't know where he ran to, but that first time I yelled, "Hey, Mark," he took off running. And I tested it out. He did it every time I yelled his name because we tried it many, many times. And that's kind of where we find ourselves in our series this morning. We're in a second week of our series called Does God Damn? And we're following an account of Jonah's life. Jonah was a man who likely lived sometime after 700 BC. And last week, Pastor Andrew talked through the first few verses of chapter 1, and I'm going to finish out the rest of chapter 1 today. And what happens at the very beginning is that God calls out, "Hey, Jonah," and then Jonah took off running. We read this in verse number 3 in Jonah chapter 1. But Jonah got up and went in the opposite direction to get away from the Lord. He went down to the port of Joppa where he found a ship. I was thinking that I said Noah, but you guys didn't yell back to me, so I'm clear. I'm in the clear. So Jonah, he went to the port of Joppa where he found a ship leaving for Tarshish. He bought a ticket and went on board, hoping to escape from the Lord by sailing to Tarshish. Jonah is called by God to bring God's message to the Ninevites. He has an opportunity to be used by God to do an amazing miracle. Nineveh is a very big city. It is a very evil city, and Jonah knows this. And so as God calls Jonah to go and preach to Nineveh, he has the opportunity to do something amazing. And instead, he runs. He takes off. Now, let me talk about this for a second. There's so many of you in here that I don't know. So many of you in here, I don't know your background. I don't know where you've been, what you've been doing. But I do know this. Running from God always brings you places you don't want to be. You may have known God, believed in God at one point in your life, but you don't anymore. Maybe God spoke to you at one point and called you to be a missionary or called you to be a pastor, and you've been avoiding that. You're still going to church, but you're not doing what He's called you to do. You're running from that. Maybe He's been speaking to you, but you're too afraid of what He's asking, and so you've been avoiding it, and you've been running from Him. It is Jonah ran from God. He found himself. First, he hid in the bottom of a boat, trying just to get out of town. In the bottom of a boat, he finds himself in the middle of a storm. Then, when we'll read it here in a little bit, the sailors threw him overboard. He then found himself in the belly of a fish where he stayed for 3 days and 3 nights. Then, after he obeyed and did what God asked, he then found himself in the right place. He had done what God asked him to do, but his attitude was wrong. And he found himself angry and depressed. I don't know why you've been running from God. Sometimes we run from God just because of the people who represent God. And because we have a bad experience in a church or a bad experience with people, we just think, I want nothing to do with God. I want nothing to do with people like that. And there are people who say they are following God who are evil. There are people who say they're following God who they're not. They've never followed Him a day in their life. We think about the incidents going on in Charlottesville over the weekend, and you have people who say they're representing, who are calling themselves neo-Nazi. You say there are people who are aligning themselves with the KKK, and there are people who will call themselves, who will align themselves with those two groups and also say that they're following Jesus. Well, that is so far from who God is and who Jesus is and what the good news of Jesus is. We know that Jesus said, I've come for everyone. He came, he eradicated every kind of boundary that existed in culture at the time when He came and became a man. He talked with people who weren't Jewish. He talked with people who were Samaritans, and they were ostracized because of their race. He accepted people whether they were very rich or whether they were very poor. Didn't matter even if they were a different religion. They didn't believe in Him. Even the people who hated Him and killed Him, He prayed for and He loved. And this is the example that He leaves for us, the people who say that they're following Jesus. And as a church, this is the type of church that we should be. It doesn't matter who comes into our building, we're going to love them. It doesn't matter who wants to come in here. If they're interested in hearing about Jesus, we're going to let them come in. It doesn't matter what they look like, what background they have, what history they have, or what color skin they have. The gospel is for everyone. Jesus came and died on a cross for mankind, not for one kind of man. And that's true for you here. And you all of a sudden now, you begin, wait a minute, you would let me come here? Yeah, we would let you come here. Everything that we do here at this church is for moments like we just had, that people will know Jesus and follow Jesus. And it doesn't matter what you've done, what you've said. If you make the decision to follow Jesus, he forgives everything. And he loves, he already does love you. And you'll know it. Why? What was it that Jonah was running from? He wasn't afraid to preach. He was a prophet. He preached prosperity. You can read about him in 2 Kings. He's recorded there. He preached prosperity to Jeroboam, I believe, and he wasn't afraid to preach. He preached to the nation. He spoke on behalf of God constantly. It wasn't that. The problem here is he was running from God's plan to forgive the Ninevites. Now, there was a couple of things happening here. One, the Ninevites weren't Jewish people. So this was very extraordinary that God would tell one of his prophets to speak to people who weren't Jewish. But he wasn't afraid of that. He was mad because he knew the reputation for the Ninevites. He knew how they harassed Jewish people. He knew how evil they were. He knew what went on in that city. And he was running because he didn't want God to love those people. He didn't want God to forgive those people. He wanted God to punish those people. Maybe you should ask this question. Noah, yes, thank you. Jonah, the poor first service. I feel so bad for them. Who am I talking about? Jonah. He was running from God's plan to forgive and change the Ninevites. Have you been running from his plan to change you? Maybe you're in this service today and you're wondering, is God going to damn you? Maybe you recognize even that you deserve it. Maybe you wonder if there's any way to be free from it. Well, there is. Jesus. And that's why he is good news. That's the power of the cross. That's why we raise our hands when we're singing, because we've been freed from so much. We've been changed from so much from who we were to who we are now. And that's why we're baptized, to symbolically show that the old is gone and we have been washed and we have been made new. There's been some argument over the book of Jonah, and you may be wrestling with this right now, or if you're not familiar with the story, you'll start wrestling with it when I tell you about it. And the Jonah, part of his story that's most famous is he was thrown overboard and then swallowed by a fish and lived in the belly of a fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Well, there's all kinds of articles you can read about that it's impossible. That cannot happen. And there's some reports like from the 1900s of fishermen who were found dead in a fish that they'd been eaten, and they were just decomposed from the acid, the stomach acid of the fish. And so it's just, people say, if you believe this story, you're an idiot. Christians are idiots for believing this story. And so you may be hearing about Jesus. You're interested. You're hopeful maybe that Jesus would forgive you and love you and change your life. But then as we talk about a guy in the belly of a fish, you think like, all right, well, maybe some other church. These people, they are just stupid. And listen, there's a few different ways that we can look at the book of Jonah, and we'll be talking about this for the 2 weeks following. And there are some Bible scholars, people who spend their entire life studying the Bible at an intense level, and they believe that, and they interpret this book of the Bible, Jonah, as an allegory. And an allegory, and the way you'd interpret this is that it's a fictional character and a fictional story that's used to show us another reality. And Probably for the first time in my life, I think it would be okay for some people to have this belief of the Bible. I don't think believing that the book of Jonah is an allegory is you giving up your right to heaven or you losing your salvation. That being said, we know that Jonah was a real guy. He really was a prophet. He really did live and serve during the time of, during that period of time. The book of 2 Kings is a historical document used to record lineage and events and activities. And then Jesus even confirmed his existence when Jesus quoted him. Jesus didn't quote him as a fictional story. He talked about him as if he were, as he was historical. And so knowing that he was a real guy and that it was historical, we're then left, well, did Jonah make up these stories? Did someone just take a famous name and add all these sequence to events? Now, many Bible scholars say that the book of Jonah is a prophetic narrative. And so knowing that it's a prophetic narrative helps you as you read it and helps you to begin to interpret it and try to understand it. So it is historical and it gives the narration of a person's life. That's the narrative part. And so there's many different books of the Bible that are narratives. So the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those are narratives. It's talking about Noah, talking about Joshua. It's just talking through the sequence of events of their life. But this book is also prophetic in that it recounts God's words to a prophet to a nation. So the books where God speaks to someone and tells them to speak to the nation of Israel or speak to the Ninevites, those are prophetic books. And this book is both of those things. Now, personally, I don't have a problem believing that the book of Jonah actually really happened. And you may discredit me, but let me say some other things I believe that are probably harder to believe than a guy was in the belly of a whale. I believe that God existed in heaven and left heaven and put on flesh, became a human, and lived a perfect life and died on a cross so that I could be forgiven of my sin. I believe that was Jesus. Jesus existed before he was born on Christmas. He was in heaven, fully God, and became fully God and fully man. I believe that. I believe that when my life ends on this earth, that my life will begin in heaven, in the presence of Jesus, on streets of gold. I believe that. And so, if I believe those two things, I believe that Jesus spoke and earth was created, spoke and light was created, spoke and animals were created. I believe that. And so, it is. If I can believe those things, it's not impossible for me to believe that God could have created a fish, made it, because it says in there, God prepared a fish to swallow Jonah. God created a fish just to swallow Jonah that had enough oxygen for a man to survive in it for 3 days. God can do that. And so it's no big deal for me. It doesn't mess up my faith to think that even though no one's ever done it before or has ever done it since, that cannot happen. So kind of wherever you are on that, that's not really the main thing that we're arguing today. We just wanted to talk about that so you could be kind of free to wrestle with what God really wants to do in your life today. This account of Jonah's life shows us something far more than God's ability. It shows us something far greater than God's ability to create or to make something happen. This book and this account of Jonah's life answers the question of our series, does God damn? And we know from the way he used Jonah to preach to the Ninevites that emphatically God does not damn. God does not damn people. He delivers people. He rescues people. He forgives people. He transforms people. That is what he's about. After the first service, someone I never met before tried to argue me on that fact. Listen, what does it say in John chapter 3? Jesus came into the world not to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. That is what he's about. It's a rescue mission. When God looks at you and your life and your predicament and the things that you've done, he doesn't think, I need to get that guy. And he's correct, here's my chance. He walked in church oh man, get ready. We're going to have a showdown. No, God doesn't think about how he's going to get you. He thinks about how he's going to rescue you. That's what he's about. That's why his interweaving in your life, that's all the things that he's done in your life. It has been to pull you out of the miry clay, to pull you out of the junk and the mess and the sin and the problems, to pull you into his love, to pull you into his forgiveness, and not just with the promise hey, I'll make you religious, not with that, but to say, I am by your side, I am your refuge, and I am your strength, I am your strong tower, I am with you, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you, I will never hurt you, I will never harm you, and not just now, but forevermore, that there's an eternity where there's no weeping, there's no sorrow, and there's no tear. That's what he has for us. Does he damn us? Does he want to? No, he doesn't. He sent Jesus, his only son, because he loves us. While we were still his enemies, while we were still pathetic, while we were still evil, Jesus died on a cross because he loved us. That's the good news. And that's what Jonah tells us. That's what this book is about, that God so loved the Ninevites that he wouldn't let Jonah run. No, Jonah, I'm going to use you to reach those people. And this is what set Jonah off. This is why he took off running. Because he knows God doesn't damn. He delivers. Jonah hates the Ninevites. And he really wants God to damn the Ninevites. He wants God to punish them, to smite them, to obliterate them. That is the prayer of his heart. I wonder if we can begin to ask ourselves some questions. Not the person next to you. This is not a time to elbow anybody. But to begin to ask ourselves, those of you who say you believe Jesus, those of you who say you follow Jesus, why don't we tell others about the goodness of God? Why don't we tell other people about his love, about his forgiveness, about how he's changed our life? If we can be honest, maybe much like Jonah, there are people in our life that we want God to damn. We don't want them to be forgiven. We don't want them in our church. We don't want them in heaven. Someone who's been coming to our church for a number of months who's not a Christian, but really wrestling with it, trying to learn about it, never gone to church in her life. And one of the weeks after service, she asked me, well, what about ISIS? Those guys are evil. What about them? What if they ask Jesus to forgive them? I said, well, he forgives them. She says, I don't like that. I don't want to be in heaven with murderers and rapists. And I said, well, that's part of the story. And no matter who we are, no matter what we've done, if we repent, if we ask him to forgive us, he forgives us. Every single one of us. And that's our prayer. That everyone, every single person, every one of you would have the opportunity to know Jesus. Noah would rather lose his own life than see the Ninevites saved. He told, thank you, Jonah would rather lose his own life than see the Ninevites saved. And he told the sailors, there was a big storm going on. The sailors were trying to figure out what was going on. They asked Jonah about it. And Jonah said, hey, it's me. I'm the reason. I'm a Hebrew. I'm running from God. Throw me overboard and you'll be free. He didn't know he was going to get swallowed by a fish. He was like, all right, I'm just going to commit suicide now. There's one way I can run. And he didn't. God still wouldn't let him run away. There's sometimes a more subtle way we ask God to damn. We don't tell people about Jesus because we don't think they'll believe. And we make the decision for them. The Ninevites should not have believed. Jonah barely preached to them. He barely preached to them. He said like 6 words. Nineveh will be destroyed in 40 days. That's all he said. And he just began repenting. A city of over 100,000 people repenting all the way. It eventually reached the king. Even the king repented. And the entire city was transformed. Or a guy preaching a reluctant message. Listen, if Jesus can change you, he can change anyone. Unless you've forgotten how far you were from him. If you think that he can't change someone else, and he can't rescue someone else, then you think too highly of yourself and too little of the cross. The cross is power to those who believe. The most desperate, the most evil person, if they ask for forgiveness, Jesus invades their heart, transforms them, and forgives them. The most self-sufficient person, they have everything, not a need in the world, perfectly happy. If they will invite Jesus into their life, they'll see how empty they really were and how much they were missing. This wasn't Jonah. Jonah knew God. And in Jonah 4:2, after the Ninevites gave their life to the Lord, Jonah said, didn't I say before I left home that you would do this, Lord? He's complaining. That is why I ran away to Tarshish. I knew you are a merciful and compassionate God, slow to get angry and filled with unfailing love. You are eager to turn back from destroying people. Maybe the reason you don't tell others about him is because you don't really know him. Maybe you've gone to church. You know him in your head. You believe in him in your head, but you don't know him as merciful and compassionate, slow to get angry, and filled with unfailing love. That's who he is. That's how he responds to us in his graciousness and his goodness. As you are here this morning, I want you to know he's calling your name. Hey, Jen. Hey, Brandon. Hey, Marilyn. He's calling you. He's calling you. He's after you. He wants friendship with you and relationship with you. He wants to forgive you and show you how much he loves you. As he calls you, stop running from him and run to him. Let him do everything in your life that he wants to do. I want us to stand. I want us to sing a song together. That's one we've never sung before. It's called Mighty Hand of God. And the bridge on the song says this: even though our hearts are prone to wander, we could never run beyond his reach. Nothing in the world could separate us from Christ, from the love of Christ, our King. We're going to sing, and I'll be back here to